Sounds like a plan to me. All right, so we are now live, I suppose.
Yep.
Great. So today we have three things, I believe. So we start with some JSON stuff, and then we look at some obsolete stuff. So since Levi is here, we probably don't have to wait for him later, which is good.
I will be checked out for like the first 20 minutes or so.
Oh, even more than I was for the first 10?
Yes.
Seems hard to believe. Okay, Leomi, then take it away for this one here.
Nice. So just a little higher. Yep. Okay, so users want to be able to deserialize JSON strings into number properties. Some particular scenarios include deserializing non-infinity and negative infinity. So I propose to add a new option to enable this scenario and also possibly allow this, serializing numbers as strings. And the motivation to do this is to better interact with various API endpoints across the web that send like strings like this in these formats. So API proposal. So I propose like a new JSON number handling on like enum on flags enum on JSON serializer options. And then the enum itself is by enum. So the options are none, which would mean there are there's no handling behavior specified. So numbers can only be read from JSON token type number and will only be written as a JSON number. Allow reading from string means exactly that. Numbers can be read from a token type of string, and this doesn't prevent numbers from being read from JSON token type number. So write a string means numbers will be written as JSON strings with quotes, not as JSON numbers. And last one is to allow named floating point literals. So you can specifically say, I want to allow reading these pre-literals on deserialization and also like writing them out on serialization. So today we don't support that. So in addition, I propose a JSON number handling attribute, which can be put per property. So like you can cherry pick, the properties you want to apply this scenario for. So this will be useful if like for most of your object graph, for instance, like you expect JSON numbers, but some subset of the API will return things that will return strings. So you can have more granularity. Okay, so just moving down to some usage scenarios, like examples. Okay, so like allowing reading numbers from strings and writing numbers as strings. So you have a class with ints, number 1 and 2. You specify options saying like allow to read from string and also like to write a string, and then we do just that, which is like so if you look at the JSON payload, number 1 has like the JSON number 1, and number 2 has a JSON string 2. So because we are allowing from reading from string, we deserialize into both properties. And you also specified to write the number as string, so we'll write both of them as string. Next example, allowing reading numbers from floating point constants and writing floating point constants. So you have like your class of numbers, like int number and float number, 2 properties. So without the new option, reading the floating point constant representations, that would fail. So you have your like int number, which is fine. But then you have this float number nen, like string, which is not fine. So we throw an exception today. And similarly on serialize, you can serialize your int number just fine, but your float.nan will give you this like argument exception, specifically saying that we don't support doing that. But with the new option, set your allow named floating point literals, and then you can read your int number and also the nen. And on serialization, we would write both of those out. So next example will be so allow reading numbers from string and support reading and writing float constants. So just a few more combinations just to see what that experience will look like. So you say to allow reading numbers from string and to also allow named floating point literals. So the first int number is a string, and so we allow that, and then so also and the second one is nen. So we also allow that. So for this serialization side, it's we thought about this a little bit, but specifically this is a little redundant because you could have just specified the first one. But moving on to the next example. Okay, so the writing, the number handling on that one should also be allow reading from string and allow named floating point literals. So right around where the cursor is on the screen, just a little about that. Yeah, so this should be allow reading from string as well. Yeah, same as that. So because you said to read from string but not write as string, we will write your -1 and then we'll also write your nen. So this combination is helpful for some scenarios. So another example is sort of the opposite, which is to write a string and allow named floating point literals. So the first example here, you just have your int number, so you deserialize into that's your JSON payload. So that's just the one thing, so that works fine, and nothing was specified for float number, so yeah, that would be a 0, the default value.
This one should have failed, right, Naomi? Because you forgot to remove the quotes.
Sorry, yeah, this one will fail. Yeah, copy and paste error. So yeah. This will fail. Yeah. But on serialization, so I'm looking at the serialization. Sorry, I'm still looking at it. So my previous pattern. Okay, so the serialization of the second one, you have an int number. Yeah, so yeah, that should be an integer as well. So that works fine, as we saw in the previous example.
Because
yeah, I've definitely mixed something up.
I think this example was supposed to be the same as this one, but without the quotes around the integer number, and then somehow it changed. But I think because I feel like the point from this morning's discussion was allow named floating point literals here means that the read would succeed for nan in quotes, but not for the number in quotes, because you didn't say numbers were allowed to be strings.
Right, on deserialization, yeah.
So we'll pretend it said the right thing.
Thanks. So now with okay, let's just look at what the option is, and then so we say write a string. So -1 will be written as a string number, and then float will be written as nan. So in this case, you do need to, but just depending on your scenario, you should pick the right combination. Okay, so some additional things to note what the behavior is. So integers can have decimal places. So the semantics are the same as if there were no quotes, except that we will escape, but I'll discuss that point later, maybe not in much more detail. But so you have a number with a decimal place, so that would throw an exception because we expect an integer which has no decimal point. Similarly, there can't be any trailing or leading trigger. So if you have 1A or something like that, then that will also not work. So leading, next one, leading or trailing white space is also not allowed. So your one space. So an additional note here is because we have the same semantics as what the serializer will do without the quotes, currency, percentage, and related formats will not work. So these tokens in the payload will cause an exception to be thrown, a similar one to the ones we see above here. So okay, yeah. So in the future we can based on user feedback, even though that's not something I'm particularly enthusiastic about. But so Newton's compat, Newton allows us implicit conversions from strings to numbers and deserialization, so no custom logic or setting is required. But we will ask that people opt into behavior because we think that this sort of behavior should be opted into. Unicef doesn't provide a built-in way to serialize numbers as strings, so you have to write custom logic to do this, like a custom converter. But this proposal includes an easy way to specify the behavior because I think it makes sense. So rewrite semantics a little more.
Leon, doesn't Newtonsoft, though, for the special literals, support serialization as strings by default? Just not all numbers?
Yeah, it allows like the floating point constants, like int.nan, I mean double.nan, float.nan, but not like 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, okay. Yep, just wanted to check that.
Sorry, like you're saying that by default, when you serialize something that is a floating point value that is not a magic one, it will always emit this without quotes. But if it's one of the magic ones, it will automatically emit them with quotes.
You mean with Newtonsoft?
Yeah.
Yes.
I see.
But with us, we throw if it's like a magic constant.
Because the JSON spec says nan, positive, and negative infinity don't exist.
Right. Well, it's just funny that Newtonsoft supports those, but it doesn't support generalizing this and saying always emit them as quotes.
Right. I was surprised myself to see that there was no like easy way to do it. Like, so a little
Is
more.
there any other behavior that Newtonsoft have with respect to numbers that we don't have it?
Okay, so one thing that Newtonsoft will support is to deserialize like nan, infinity, and negative infinity without quotes. But we regard like the only constants that we allow as like null, according to JSON spec. So, and these three like literal values, like case sensitive, are the most common that float around the web. I think that it will suffice if we like support just these and then get looser, like based on user feedback in the future.
So are you saying that Newtonsoft supports reading them if there are no quotes? You just have literally the string NaN?
That's right.
How is it even legal, Jason?
It isn't.
It's not.
They support both ways. Newtonsoft supports it with quoted or unquoted, just for clarification.
I see. Well, that seems interesting.
Yeah. I mean, something like given the structure of the options, like how it's stated as allow floating point literals, like there's nothing about string, so we could easily just like add it later on. Right now we'll throw, but we have the option to not throw in the future.
I mean, it makes sense to me. I mean, the question again is defaults, right? So I think what you're proposing earlier is that we basically have the defaults to match what we currently do, right? Which would be number handling none.
Right.
Is there any reason why we wouldn't opt in saying allow reading from string and allow named floating point literals by default? Because it just seems the only thing we would do is it would make more scenarios work, but it would not be breaking, right?
I mean, the question is, should it be default to strict or lax, right? And strict is in many ways better, and lax is make more things work. So,
yeah, I mean, so I guess, so I can tell you where I'm coming from. So on the one hand side, I agree with you. On the other hand, like I've spent some time over the last weeks playing with Blazor, and in that context also, of course, using the whole stack, which includes serialization. And one thing that I found was that what frustrated me sometimes was that the way serialization works in ASP.NET is it's kind of just a transport mechanism to get your data from point A to point B. So you're not actually looking at the wire format at all. You just basically use it to just send you objects across machine boundaries. And what's hard sometimes is when things magically disappear from your payload, right? So for example, by default, we don't support time span values, right? We don't throw, but we also don't serialize them. So which ended up in my case with like funny behavior where half my objects made it to the server, and then I made, of course, incorrect assumptions because the time spans were all zeros, right? And that's another example where we would basically lose data in the payload right now, right? Where on one hand side it's infinity, on the other hand it comes out as non-infinity, right? Probably comes out as 0 would be my guess. So I'm just wondering like how we think about that, because I think in the context of ASP.NET, like I think most people would probably appreciate if we make more scenarios work. But I understand Jeremy's concern about like our design principle so far was spec compliance rather than making more scenarios work. But I just want to be clear that this is kind of in conflict with the goal of developers to just have their objects being thrown over the fire.
I mean, if it's ASP.NET, we already have the default serializer settings for web, and we can certainly say that it's on for default for web, but not for default API usage.
Yeah, so that's kind of where I'm heading. It's like, so because when we talk about defaults, right, there's scenarios, right? And the problem is like if we even for web, right, where do we draw the boundary for breaking changes? Because, for example, if we say in the web we we set write as string to true by default, then you do change the wire format, right? Like practically speaking, you also change the wire format if you make more things serializable. But I'm not sure that we would care about that. So, for example, we could imagine that, we add more primitive types or pseudo primitive types to the default set of things we support, like time span values, for example, right? But, there would be a breaking change in the sense that, V1 produced one JSON payload, and V2 would produce more, right? But I think for developers, most of the time it would just translate into more things just work without funny errors.
Yeah, I would also agree with Mo here in that while having strict is better for like security and stability and everything else, especially for beginner programmers and people wanting to use APIs, they tend to be a lot happier with things that quote unquote just work.
Until they don't. But yeah.
Right. But
yeah,
they're still happier with things that just work, and then having to go tweak it later as they find additional constraints they need.
I think that's my general problem, is that I think, to me, I would be much happier for spec compliance if you would say everything that is not strictly in alliance with the spec will always throw, because then at least when stuff gets dropped. Right now the problem is sometimes we drop information, and the only way to find out is by actually looking at what you sent over and what you received, right? And that's, I think, the thing that tricks beginners is that, you send an object to the server, everything is hunky-dory, and on the server, like, stuff doesn't work the way you expect to until you actually do it into the payload and you realize, oh shit, half my object didn't make it through. Because if you would throw an exception, the nice thing with those things is we can actually tell you what to do. What you could say, sorry, using a data type that we don't know how to serialize, so we just drop it from the payload. And then, apologies, there's a fire alarm testing going on in my building right now.
Yeah, I mean, no matter, well, I guess, unless we did something silly like make the default be write as string but not allow reading from string, then .NET talking to .NET will just work. The question is .NET talking to other things, of what scenarios exist by default that should work out of the box.
Well, so like it was called out on the issue here, a lot of interchange formats use strings by default because the number one thing that uses JSON is JavaScript, because that's where JSON came from. And JavaScript internally represents all numbers as double. And by default, it doesn't read as int32. If you want an int32, it will read as a double, and then you have to convert it to an int32, which means precision loss, among other things. And so people use strings to avoid problems with interchange across languages.
Yeah, I think that's something I don't know how we want to make forward progress. So, like, let's just decouple these two things. Maybe let's have a generic conversation about defaults and how we make more things work with the system text or JSON stack. But as far as APIs go, I think the proposal that Naomi here has makes sense to me. The naming makes sense to me. The flags design makes sense to me. The attribute I'm a little bit ambivalent about, I have to say, though, because I'm struggling with finding a good reason why I would make this locally configurable as well. Maybe we just do it for consistency, but I would think that those should probably be global settings only.
Yeah, I mean, the
on
thought on that one is if you only have one value that you expect ever to have the number nan, and you don't want it to appear in other places. So
Yeah,
one
but
of them
like-
you turn on the floating point thing. I guess the problem is you can't turn or I guess at the attribute on a individual element would replace whatever the higher setting is. So you can turn things off by just specifying the attribute again.
Is there
Where
like
would this attribute get applied to? Like, you didn't specify like the targets. Would this be property only?
Yeah, I looked at the other ones and it's property and field, so I kind of already had that as a local note.
Yeah, because I mean, like, if you would make type level work, then maybe. But if you don't make type level work, then I guess that seems very tedious. But maybe
I mean, the
this
one
is-
thing about this for me, like, there's a pattern in GraphQL that you can have like a composition server between like various APIs, some that you want and some that you don't. So just a scenario where you could get JSON that isn't uniform, like across the whole object graph that you get back into .NET.
Right, but like, but the setting would be like, it doesn't matter, right? You don't have to be consistent, right? It just means you're basically, if I say allow reading from string and allow name floating point literals, it just means that if somebody gave me quotes, I can read it. If somebody didn't give me quotes, I can still read it, right? So there's still one config that works for the whole thing.
I mean, but you might want to have like strict behavior on like parts where you know like it works well. I
Yeah.
mean, maybe that's not the like the common case, but
You know, alternatively, if you're doing something like the Azure services where you talk to a front end and it takes your payload and sends it to a back end, if the front end wants numbers as numbers but the back end wants numbers as strings, you would be able to slap on the back end level of the segment, write these numbers as strings. So you
I
can
guess.
still internally type them as numbers, and that just changes the wire format. But yeah, I do agree that it would probably make sense to be able to then slap it on a whole type. It'll just make the serializers lookup more complicated.
which is fine. It's just the testing.
I mean, we can approve the shape and they can fail to deliver the feature. So
Yeah, like, I mean, yeah, I don't want to like say like make the serializer 10x slow, right? I have no idea how expensive these checks are, but I assume you cache the result anyway, so it shouldn't matter whether you had to do a walk at some point.
That's right. Like we'll just be on the warm up, so we pay for it once.
I mean, you probably should be consistent with the other ones. Like, if like, I don't know whether the other ones also should be type level or not. So like, if the other ones already are property and field only, then we probably should start with property and field only for this one, and then we can have a separate discussion whether it makes sense to promote some of them to type level. But
well, I think the other ones are things like ignore.
name,
And,
yeah, ignore
and
name don't make sense on the type level. Yeah.
We have JSON converter that is for both. That definitely makes more sense.
Right. All right, then, yeah, I guess unless there's any more confusion, I would just approve this shape as is.
So one discussion quickly on the code examples is that, Lema, you were ORing in the allow name floating point literals, but you really don't have to, correct?
In some scenarios, like e.g., allow from string or like allow floating point literals. So yeah, so this one right above the cursor. So in this case, you didn't need the second option.
You don't need it in the read example, but you do in the write example, because since it's not writing as strings, if it didn't allow named floating point literals, it would throw as I can't serialize this value when it hit this guy.
I mean, the other thing on reading, I just maybe realized is like, if we allow like unquoted NaN and infinity, then you would actually need that.
Well, that would require changing the JSON reader to add another non-compliance mode.
No, the serializer can just like do it. It doesn't have to delegate it to the reader.
But the reader would say it was in an invalid state, that it, like...
I mean, you wouldn't pass it to the reader at all. Oh, I see. Oh, I see.
When reading the payload,
You
it
do-
would
you
see,
do- yeah.
I saw a colon
Yeah.
followed by the letter N, that's illegal.
Yeah, we need to add like something to the reader to allow that. So another reason maybe to not do it, but if we do it, then this would make sense.
So one question I have is like, why is the enum, like a flex enum constrained to byte? I think in the past we said we should do int unless there's a reason why we should use byte.
Oh, yeah.
I was about to ask the same.
I mean, my local implementation right now, I have it as an int. I just wanted to tell if it's like any faster if I do some bitwise operation.
It's actually faster to use int for bitwise operations and such.
I see.
I was going to ask in the context of there may be other things we want to support in the future, like for example, allow JSON numbers to be handled as hex, or things like that.
Yeah, like byte seems, I mean, you basically have 8 values, which is not that many to play with. So yeah, 32-bit is probably safer.
Okay.
All right. I'm editing your comment right now, Emo, to add in the attribute targets.
Okay, so I'm also editing right now, so we'll have fun merging this.
Well, I also removed the constraint, so.
Yeah, that's also fine. Like
right.
I'll just paste my notes over this, and because I also write some bullet points right now.
Okay, I've hit save. Go for it.
Comments should really be individual gists, so we can get the full feature of a version control tool. All
right, so done with this one?
Yeah, so the only thing I wanted to add to the comment was we should have an old chat or discussion for .NET 5. I'll set up a dedicated meeting for this, I think, because there's probably some discussion we should have. Yeah, now that the content has changed, GitHub, what are you doing? All right, go to the next one.
Okay.
Don't wait for me.
Yeah, if you didn't already remove the blocking tag, you can click that button too.
Okay, so this one is mostly community. So if we can just go to the proposed API. So the current behavior is we have JSON ignore condition when writing default. And you can specify that globally on JSON serializer options or like per property. So this will mean that any any property or field that is the default value, that's like a reference type of value type, will be ignored on serialization. But we've gotten feedback that people want to easily be able to just specify just only null, like reference types should be ignored on serialization. So the way you could do that before was ignore null values, like specified globally. And in earlier preview, we had when null as its own like enum value on this enum. But we moved that and said we want to have like a simplified concept of default, since default both means null and like value type default, which I think is still a valid like concept to have, and just add when writing null so that you can have like just for reference types. And in the future, like if people want this, which I don't think will be a common case, but we have the flexibility to add a when writing like value type default for specifically just value types. So I have some like simple usage examples here. Scrolling down a little bit.
Sorry, like you may have said it, but I missed to use like in the text you say defaults are important for front ends. What do you mean by that? Is it because in JavaScript when you didn't send the value it's null rather than the .NET notion of 0? I
believe that. So that bit I didn't write that, but that's the concept which like many of the people who have complained about this like specify, to say like if something is not present in the payload, then I mean if it's actually, can you repeat the the what you mentioned.
Yeah, so basically you said like when serving JSON for frontends, then default values of value types are extremely important. It's not like null. I assume that's because in JSON, when you didn't initialize a property, it's effectively null rather than 0, because JSON has not JSON. JavaScript has no notion of like types with fields, right? It's all effectively a dictionary, right? So versus in .NET, when you didn't set an int, the default value is 0, not null, right? So I think I guess that's where that's
I believe
coming
that'll be
from.
undefined. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, for objects, when we don't send null values, then on the client side they're effectively equivalent for not sending them because they're undefined or null, right?
Right.
Versus when we didn't send an int, well, now suddenly the int is null rather than 0. I guess that makes sense to me then.
Right. So yeah, the usage examples is similar to what we have today. You just specify when null, like globally in this first example. So just to note that it doesn't work on deserialization as the enum value suggests. It's just for when you're writing null, and it works for serialization, and it doesn't affect value types. So I mean, one question is, okay, so property is the next thing, right? Because we have a property option. If so, in a similar thing, like it's null, then don't serialize it. But if someone were to put this on a value type property, like I believe the correct behavior would be to throw, since that's not a valid option, because a value type can be null. Like, is there something that I want to be like? I mean, we're strict in the same way in other places. So I just wanted to call it out that that's probably the logic I would want to write to get this, and if there's any opposition to that.
So basically the change you would suggest then is basically having when writing default and when writing null, rather than just having when writing default.
Right. I mean, yeah, that's the proposal.
Yeah, it makes sense to me that if somebody has put it as a property or put it as an attribute on a property and the property is a value type of throwing of I don't like the combination of things you told me to do makes no sense. Seems fine. It's effectively a design time exception that you catch at the first time you're generating the serializer for the type. So
I mean, nullability, of course, is the exception.
right, because it always is. Because it has an entire section of the C# language spec.
Not just that, it's specified by the runtime too.
Yeah.
So my only concern is I don't like having when writing default and when writing null parallel to each other, because intuitively when writing default should include when writing null, right? Because null is a form of default.
It does.
On the other hand, sorry, what?
It does. When writing default includes null and 0 and false and the empty time span and
Oh, I see.
but when writing null is reference types or reference null,
I
but
see.
not the value type nulls. So it is a subset of when writing default.
Gotcha.
And we used to have this functionality. It's deprecated, right? We used to have a bool that says ignore null values or something like that, and then we removed it or deprecated it, and then we replaced it with this enum, but we didn't add back the special null only because we didn't think people cared about only null. So somebody cares about it, and now we're kind of adding it back, but only on write. The other bool also supported read.
Yeah, to me, like, it makes sense to say on the client it matters. Basically, the receiver of the payload may care, but if the receiver of the payload is .NET, then I think it's hard to understand why they would care about null versus default. Because it's kind of a function of what the type system is you're serializing into, right? So in that sense, I think it makes sense to say that the setting that we have only really allows that distinguishing when we actually write stuff out rather than reading stuff back in. And that's a breaking change between previews, right? not between stable releases, right?
You mean this proposal?
I guess in your case
No,
it's
it's not.
additive
It's
anyway
not
because
additive.
it's
Yeah.
because I see.
We
Never
already
mind
did
then.
this breaking change.
Yeah. All right.
All right, so in the chat, there's, I feel like we had this discussion when we talked about the current 0, 1, and 2 of why is never 0 instead of always 0, because it looks like it used to be always was the 0. But looking at the attribute where you would specify it, it looks like condition is an optional property and it defaults to always, so it probably doesn't matter. But it came up again, even though we're only talking about adding number 3.
Is there the none versus never discussion as well that we want to have again? I'm not sure where that landed us.
So I'm, we're also going to pop back to the previous issue because I hadn't noticed comments in chat, and they have a good one. But yeah, I think this one we've already had that discussion, and I don't think we want to rehash it. So we approved never as 0 previously. Now we're just talking about adding number 3, and I think number 3 is good.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So it makes perfect sense.
All right, so I think this one is good as proposed because we're just adding the 3 value here.
I'll just paste it in. Let me just mark this as non-blocking.
Okay, and
then
to bounce back for a moment to the previous issue, chat raised a good point. I guess I'll go ahead and call you out. Frederick made a good point that JSON number handling none reads sort of strange. It is our common value for flags, so it's probably fine, but maybe we should consider using a different name like strict. Other words that were proposed were normal, numeric, and default, but
Yeah, I personally wouldn't mind strict myself.
But yeah, default is weird because if we make the default not be none, then default isn't the default. And normal is, again, what does normal mean?
Yeah, I don't mind strict. Strict makes sense. I mean, strict hopefully also doesn't change over time though.
I mean, from the serializer's perspective, hopefully not, but maybe like the web options can set their own value, if that's what you mean.
Well, I mean, I'm saying like what Jeremy did about default hopefully doesn't apply to strict in the sense that hopefully there's not rules that, you know, I guess doesn't matter. Like there's not a new type that will be invented anytime soon in JSON, so it's probably fine.
Yeah, I mean, I will say we do have a do level guideline that flags enum 0 value should be named none, but
exceptions.
Right. But in this case, I think, because I mean the weirdness would be is if you say strict pipe allow reading from string, like the fact that we named the strict means that you may think that it means something other than none of these options. So maybe none is still the best because it tells you don't pipe it with something. Where by pipe I mean or.
So you're just saying we should keep it at none then?
I'm saying both things, and I'm hoping that one of them resonates really strongly with someone, or we can just say the guideline says none, where we have conflicting feelings about renaming it. So let's stick with the guideline.
Yeah, my only conflicting thing is that none doesn't promise much. On the other hand, none is also weird because it sounds a bit like we're not dealing with numbers at all, which is clearly a lie, right?
Yeah, and I think that was what the comment was in the chat of like we're not saying we don't handle numbers. We're saying that It is not allow reading from string, not write as string, and not allow named floating point literals. That's what none means. Not everything else.
Yeah, I would say like honestly, like, I actually like strict because it's a term we have used elsewhere, and having that the default kind of makes sense because that's kind of the philosophy of the stack, and it makes it very clear what it does, in my opinion.
Yeah, I know that there's an ordering behavior, so if we did none and then aliased it to strict, would that help? Or should we just name it strict?
I mean, if you make the first field none and the second one strict, I believe toString will show none. So you can probably, like, yeah, depending on how you order the fields, you probably can control the toString behavior.
Yeah.
I'm
Frederick
not sure
also
it would
suggests
make a lot of sense, though.
no special handling, which is similar to strict but uses a negative term.
Yeah, it's a bit long for my taste.
Yeah.
And
all right. I'm good with saying strict, and then we stop thinking about it.
yeah,
Can I get a second?
I like strict, so it makes it more clear without reading the doc. My opinion.
yeah, I think strict is something people can have an intuitive understanding of what it means.
Yeah. If we don't already have an analyzer that warns that somebody is zeroing in or oring in a named zero from a flags, then maybe we want one.
Because if we took the other approach where we were not strict by default and then you tighten it down, I mean, we could have designed it that way. And like I said, I don't think it's obvious until you read the doc. So, and that's why I do like strict.
Right. Yeah. So the only feedback that I would then have is if somebody wants like strict, if they wrote strict pipe write as string and they think that means something different than just write as string, that maybe an analyzer should warn that you're combining strict, but then it's not related to this feature. It's related to anything where we have a zero that is named something other than none, or even the none. So somewhere on our list of potential analyzers, if we don't already have it, is you did a bitwise combination and you ored in a thing that is the constant value 0. Hey, this is probably not what you want.
Right.
So, but that, yeah. All right. So we renamed this one to strict, and past 20 minutes, so hopefully Levi's brain is working.
Hi.
Hello. I've heard you want to obsolete some stuff.
Thank you, Frederick.
I do wish to obsolete some stuff, and I believe you and Jeff wish to obsolete some stuff too. But Jeff is busy at a doctor's appointment, so it's going to be you and me here.
The cool thing is I can decide to wear a different hat here because you author the document, so I can. Oh shit, my name is. Never mind, I can't do that. So my devil's advocate role will be very much non-compelling, given that I am listed as the first person in this document. Yeah, so like the long story short is like we actually did introduce changes to the obsolete attribute in this release. One of the reasons was because obsoleting stuff has been historically very hard in the .NET framework. There was some insane compat bar restrictions, but then there are also more like pragmatic problems with the obsolete attribute in that it can be very noisy if we obsolete technologies. It worked for individual methods and properties, but it doesn't really work for technologies because as soon as you mark a type, you get hundreds of violations potentially, and which kind of leaves the author only with a global suppression mechanism, which is not very useful. And so now that we have that feature to actually give each obsolete a different ID, we went over and decided, like, here's a bunch of stuff that we may want to obsolete, and this is what this document is basically capturing. I think when we started this document, we had a fairly runtime-focused view on this, which is kind of features that we didn't port to core, or we ported to core in terms of the APIs to make more code compile, but we didn't actually port the technology. And so what Levi, I think, did is a pass over all the things that we may want to obsolete because they don't do what we think they do, but we'll probably do another pass of actual library function that we don't like. So I think the first one here should be relatively uncontroversial in my opinion, because if you don't know what CRs are, then you should probably be in agreement with us obsoleting it because it's still not important to you. If you know what it is, then it's fair to say that we supported it in the context of SQL CLR, so that is largely ripped out. I think the only thing that we have left is the finalizer thingy. What is it called?
Oh, the critical finalizer object?
Yeah.
Yes, and that type actually does have a side effect on .NET Core. So there's no desire at this moment in time to obsolete it.
Yeah, that makes sense. But on top of that, you shouldn't really do that anyway. You should use safe handle. So, yeah. The GAG is no longer supported. That seems like a no-brainer. I don't even know what this API does. Threader board, you have all used that API, but you shouldn't. That's what cancellation tokens are for. And on core, we basically made it not work anyway, so we throw from it if you try to use it. I don't know why we added the API in the begin with, but I guess that was part of the .NET Standard push. Yeah, there's some default implementations of crypto algorithms that are no longer supported.
Yeah, this is also in the, we left it out of core on purpose, but we brought it back for type unification with that standard.
And to be clear, like none of these not supported exceptions are new, right? That's basically since they were introduced in core, right? All we do now is basically put an attribute on it to tell you upfront that they will blow up.
Yep.
Yeah, create PDB generator is what was that part of? Yeah, that's part of some common APIs I think that we had for debugging support, which we no longer support because you're no longer running just on Windows. Authentication manager, authenticating pure authenticating, no longer supported, on top of unsupported. I don't even know what these are for, so I guess that seems fine. So I guess how did you find these APIs? You harvested them, Levi, or how did you just search the code base?
So most of these are things that I've just wanted to kill for a long time. Create PDB generator actually that was not my suggestion. I just need to spend a little bit of time recalling why that was added to the list. But the fact that it throws PNSE makes it a candidate anyway, and that we don't have a task to ever bring it back in a future version.
Right. Well, we don't. I mean, to me, the most compelling argument is why this is that API is because we already said we don't support generation of binaries with the runtime. Right. This week, you should use a compiler or a metadata reader writer. And so, to me, PDB generator is part of that. Right. Ref emit save doesn't exist either. All right. Some remoting APIs. Yeah, I remember this. We had to bring back Marshall by ref object for compatibility reasons.
Yes, types like stream subclass Marshall by ref object, but they don't take advantage of the APIs that are marked as obsolete.
Right.
Or the APIs that we desire to mark as obsolete.
Right. Yeah. CAS. Same thing.
Yeah. CAS, the APIs either no-op or throw an exception, depending on which API you call.
Right. So you're proposing to mark them obsolete. So do you propose to be any marked as obsolete as errors, or is the assumption that they're all obsolete as warning?
So the principal permission attribute constructor, we already obsoleted as error. It is now an error to include that in a .NET Core application. Every other type that's listed here, we would obsolete as warning, not as error. And the reason for that is that principal permission attribute, if you apply it to your code, it is dangerous to do so in .NET Core. Whereas these other attributes, if you apply them to your code, it's confusing that you have done so, but it's not necessarily dangerous. And when I say dangerous, I mean the fact that you applied it to your code implies that you intended for it to perform a permissions check, but it's not actually going to do that.
Yeah, return true is not a permission check, as it turns out.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, all of those. Jesus, there's a lot of them.
Yeah, and the interfaces like iPermission, iStackWalk are intended to support the CAS infrastructure, so they also go away. Or
So
not go
does you
away,
do-
but are obsoleted.
So I think you're proposing IDs here, right? So I assume everything that's listed under CAS would have the same obsolete ID.
Correct. So Jeff wrote this list and posted it, and he arranged everything into buckets, and each bucket gets the same ID.
Perfect.
We
Yeah, that
already
kind of-
have an ID that we're using for principal permission attribute, so we could use that same ID for all the rest of the CAS stuff.
That works.
It turns out we probably didn't have to assign an ID to that to begin with because it is obsolete as error, so there's no way to suppress it.
Right, but it changes the docs and stuff. So
It does, yes.
But that's
It
actually a
points
good
you to the
point.
right place.
That's actually a good point, though. Like, we probably should not mix severities, though.
So you don't want. So you want mslib 0002 is always warning or always error, not sometimes one and sometimes the other.
Yeah, because I mean, like, that's just not how diagnostic IDs work, right? Like, you usually attach a severity to a diagnostic ID. So it's a bit weird if the same diagnostic ID is sometimes a warning and sometimes an error in the same build. And then then some occurrences you can suppress and some you can't, right? That seems confusing. And it seems
That's
like,
fair.
yeah, I think, like, generally speaking, also I would say that it seems principal permission is bad enough as a case to deserve its own ID, to just talk about it separately, and the rest is just a bunch of machinery that you shouldn't care about,
Right.
as a warning, right?
And their docs pages, presumably the principal permission one has all of the this is what you need to do instead, and these other CAS ones are just delete your code. Like this returns true. So.
Yeah, so I have an issue linked to this that proposes a fixer for some of these, and depending on how the code is written, the fixer can sometimes just suggest removing the attribute entirely. But there are certain cases where the developer really needs to consider what they were trying to accomplish, and that the fixer should not make recommendations in those scenarios, because we don't know what you were trying to do.
Right. So, assuming that I recall correctly, a fixer is triggered by a diagnostic ID and not by any context. So if you want a fixer sometimes, those sometimes need a different ID. That different
Okay.
ID can be an analyzer produces an ID and is different than the obsolete warning. But if simply the presence of this obsolete error means a fixer should wake up, you get the light bulb based on the proper code was issued, and then if it looks at it and says I have no fix for this, they get a weird experience, which is light bulb, and then they click on whatever the text for the fixer is, and then it says I have no suggestions, and that's a bad user experience.
Yeah, and I consider, honestly, you and Steve and Boya the subject matter experts on this, so your feedback, your opinion, I would defer to.
Yeah, this is my recollection of a similar experience where that's what Manish said happens, and I just trust him. But if I'm remembering wrong, then we're playing the game of telephone.
Yeah. So somebody in chat is asking, do we really want to give up being able to globally mute obsolescence in MS Build in favor of being forced to list each bucket ID separately? I would say yes. So ironically, yesterday I watched a Pluralsight course on logging, and our old friend Nicholas Blumhardt, who basically talked about production logging, and he said, funny enough, that in any given environment you have way more occurrences of messages than message formats, kinds of loggings, if you will. And like, I think obsolescence is very similar, right? Like we have way more occurrences of things you want to obsolete than we have, categories for that. And I think, in this list here is like there's 8, categories being proposed. I would assert that by and large, even if we add more things to it, we will never exceed like 20 or 30 of those, right? So I think, I think it's acceptable to say for any given code base, you may have to add 2, 3, 4, 5 suppressions to your project file. That's still better than globally turning off the entire feature, because the problem with obsolete being turned off globally is that it loses its value, right? Because as soon as you do that once, the next release, we make more things obsolete, you're not made aware of those. And if you don't care, then tough luck, you have to add one more line to your project file. But it's based on the order of like 1 or 2 lines, every time you upgrade your project file from one release to another. And that seems to me largely acceptable. Also, I would expect most people to just fix the obsoletions, because one of the things we're doing this release as well is we're adding more code fixes to help you rewrite your code and move from one API to the other when that's possible. But most of these suppressions that we propose here are probably things people haven't picked up anyways. And if they have picked it up because they're converted to .NET Framework code base, then generally speaking, we want them to know of these things. We don't want them to just, keep using CAS attributes, right?
Yeah,
by the way,
so as a counter argument to that, I don't disagree with what you're saying, but as a counter argument to it, I mean, if you look at something like nullable, which ends up triggering potentially a large number of warnings, many more warnings than actually warning IDs, but still a decent number of warning IDs. They also added the nullable keyword for no warn, which basically allows you to basically say, all of the nullable IDs can be suppressed by putting in just say nullable, and then they can all be suppressed together. And that's because if you're gradually migrating, you do want to kind of be able to start off in a world where you're not getting any warnings for any of it, and then you can switch away from that and opt into the specific ones you don't want. And it feels like if you're migrating a project from .NET Framework and you do have a lot of these things and they're not actually causing you problems yet, but the right thing to do would be to get rid of them. You have to do a non-trivial amount of work if we did have 30 different IDs to go and find them all and list them out in your no warn so that you can make forward progress.
Right.
Yeah. So by the way, you don't have to do that. You actually can you actually can no warn the CS 0618 if you want to, which just turns off all which suppresses all obsolete warnings straight up. We just don't want people to do that. But you can do it if you really want to.
But not if you give it a diagnostic ID, can you? If you give it a diagnostic
ID. In my experience, that does work. Did that change recently?
I think my spec left it open. My understanding from talking to the compiler guys is that because of the way the suppression mechanism works, as soon as you give it a different diagnostic ID, it won't suppress those.
Okay. Maybe I'm just using
part of my concern.
I mean, I would say, I don't think it's that bad, because the way you do it is in the IDE, you can just control the suppression, and it will basically add a global suppression for the ID. And, you do this 10 times, and then you have all the diagnostic IDs that occur in your project.
I mean, we could also suggest a feature to the compiler team of they add the word obsolete, and that's anything that came out of an obsolete attribute. That would just be a tooling feature, not a attribute feature.
Or just enable the obsolete 0618 or whatever it is to apply to all of them.
Right.
Well, the problem with that is that it basically means existing code bases who already did that will never see new obsoletions then.
Yes, but if an existing code base did that, if they said, I do not want obsolete, then why would we start showing them obsolete?
Well, the problem is that, as I said, the reason why we did this feature was because people had to do that in order to do anything meaningful, right? And so now we're basically saying, instead of doing one global opt-out switch for eternity, you just suppress the cases that you have so that you can actually learn about new cases as they come up.
Right, but that's assuming that they chose to do that because they only cared about existing ones, not because of new ones. I'm not sure that's a valid assumption.
Well, I'm saying we can make it 2 different features if we cared, right? But I would say I would not say because an existing project already did that, that's clearly what they meant. But I'm not against adding a global opt-out switch. I'm just saying that the existing switch I don't think is the right way to do it. But I think that's we can talk to the compiler team. At first I need to verify that that's the behavior that you actually get, because Levi seems to suggest that the existing behavior or the behavior that people have right now is if they did the obsolete for the previous ID, the compiler will turn it off entirely.
Well, to be fair, I may have been using an old version of the compiler or the IDE, so it's someone should definitely double check that.
Yeah, and then to come back to a thing you were saying, Emo, I assume, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that once we produce a diagnostic ID with this new model, we would not add new things to that same ID in a later release.
I would say we could. So, for example, take.
How is that different from? Sorry.
Yeah. So let me
how
just,
is that different from? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So let me just give the example right that's on screen right now. If we look at 8-point codex of security, right? Let's say we missed one of them, like key container permission, isolated storage permission, or one of those, right? I see no problem with adding that in .NET 6 because I mean, if it's just under the existing umbrella, like if you told us the last release you don't care about CAS, well then, yeah, you still don't care about CAS, and that's fine, right? So I think that's reasonable. But if you turned off all of obsoletions because there were like 400 warnings regarding CAS, if you started to obsolete some HTTP client APIs, well then you probably want to know about those, right? So I would say diagnostic IDs are really for features, right? So if we obsolete a feature, if we missed an API, we should feel free to apply this attribute in a later release. If it's a secondary feature, it should be a separate ID. That's how I think about that.
So I guess the statement wouldn't be that we would never do it. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think for what it's worth, I think it's a big assumption to make that people actually care about obsolescence.
Well, so that's the thing, right? So like on the one hand side, yes. On the other hand, no, right? I mean, like we have received this feedback multiple times from people that, our docs that point out issues with APIs are not very accessible because people can't reason about them or can't see them, and they have asked us to obsolete stuff, right? So it's kind of like the fact that we haven't obsolete stuff on full framework largely is because we haven't found a way to make it non-noisy and also making it useful, right? And I think that's.
But then there's the flip side. We say this works fine. Why are you telling me I can't use it? Why are you causing the noise?
We're not saying this works fine. That's the thing. That's why we're obsoleting them.
The CAS attributes are not causing any problems in my code base. Why are you introducing 400 warnings?
So the reason that we
I'm not disagreeing that we should do it. I'm saying like this is a very real pain that this causes.
No, I understand that there's pain, but I'm saying like the tooling is good enough to suppress that, right? Because all you have to do is you go on the first warning, you control dot, you say suppress in global file. It adds one attribute or one. I don't even know whether they have the support to do it in the project file, but there's one code fixer generically that will add a suppression for the diagnostic ID to your project or to your root global assembly info.cs file. And so, given that on this list right now there's 10 categories, clicking 10 times in any reasonable code size, I think is fine because it's not proportional to the number of occurrences. It's just proportional to the number of obsoletions we are doing, and that is not a large bucket that will grow significantly over the years, right? What will grow and what is largely the problem with large code bases is that look at CAS, right? There's like, I don't know, 40 types. You can easily have, as you said, hundreds and hundreds of violations, but they all have the same ID to suppress them, and that seems fine to me.
I think it's a bigger issue, but okay.
Yeah. And then as for reuse, I think maybe it would be more fair to say that in general we expect new obsoletions to be new across new versions to be new diagnostic codes, but if we feel strongly that it is an existing one, then we would do it. But it would be more the exception than the rule.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay.
I mean, that's the thing with separate. That's what I'm saying. You need to think of these as features, right? Not as waves, right?
Right.
And then I think it makes sense. Like, I mean, it's basically what I'm trying to say is, to me, it's not a breaking change to add a new API under an existing diagnostic ID. It usually just means you fucked up. It usually just means you forgot one type. Which, looking at CAS, I mean, who is to say that's all of them?
All right. Okay. I was going to say, I see here that we have classes that implement interfaces, but did we do the interfaces? And yes, that was just the bullet before classes that implement that interface. All right, so Kaz just took a whole page, or several pages.
Yeah, so I think that's it, right? So as far as, I mean, to Stephen's point, like Stephen, if you feel strongly that this is a larger issue, then I'm curious, like, what your proposed fix for that would be.
At a minimum, I think there should be a single action you can take to disable everything.
So, like, I know that with a thing that's not on this list, X509 certificate 2.private key. That's a get set property in framework. It's defined as get set in core for API compat. The set always throws in core. And no one should really even use the get because it has complicated legacy behaviors, and we added replacement methods that are strongly typed instead of the weakly typed property. And one of the more common things that I see on Stack Overflow is someone's like, hey, I did this thing, I'm using private keys, stuff isn't working, what should I be doing? And it's like, well, you should call like get RSA private key or whatever algorithm you think you're using instead. And so that one would definitely be whether it's an analyzer or an obsolete or whatever, of something that you write the code and it says this is not the code you wanted to be writing. And obsolete attribute is a way we could do that doesn't require building an analyzer per problem. And so that would be the kind of case where, because really what you want, I think in the large part, if you've already written code, you probably don't want to be told something's obsolete. But when you're writing new code, you want to be told this is not the way you want to do things. But until someone invents the notion of new code versus old code analyzers, I think this is the best we're going to get.
Yeah, I mean, let me double check this whether this is whether the existing. So let me put it this way: if the existing obsolete suppression works already, Stephen, is your point addressed, or is there more to do?
Then I will shut up.
Okay.
No, we don't want you to shut up. We want you to alert us to these kinds of problems. Definitely.
I mean, my concern stems from like trying to roll out, trying to experiment with a new analyzer pack and try and roll that out, say, across .NET Runtime. And it's extremely iterative, especially if you're in a code base which has different builds that build in different source files that aren't always active at one time, whether you're building for different OSs or Net Standard 2 versus Net Standard 2.1. And it's very, very iterative. You suppress one thing, and then you do a build, and it might take however long your build takes before you can find out the next problem. And you can sit there for hours trying to do this kind of stuff. And as much as we'd like to believe that VS is snappy, like with big projects, running these analyzers can take a long time to actually even alert you to the fact that there's one.
Yeah, to be clear,
So
I'm not saying that
where I'm
VS is snappy. All I'm saying is that there's only dozens or so buckets of things we have.
Right. I mean, the problem would be, taking past experience. You get something like Office, or even what we have in our .NET runtime build system, where it's not one solution, right? It's the build system. You're trying to upgrade to a new version of the SDK as a build in central engineering somewhere, and now you have 700 different projects that are getting some level of warning, and you really do want to, I mean, in those big build systems, there's somewhere going to be your top level, what flags am I passing on every invocation of the compiler, and you can do whatever. But and certainly once you've said ignore all obsoletions, now everyone is in trouble forever. But it is definitely a problem with big engineering systems when you're building more than one project of any time any new warning or error pops up. And that's essentially why we stopped obsoleting things, because people like Office kept complaining. So I think I'm arguing both ways, but I like doing that.
Yeah, so by the way, the default code fixer will suggest to either suppress it literally in source, which is surrounding the occurrence with the pragma, which you almost never want. And then there is configure severity none, and then it will just create an editor config file or add to the existing editor config file and just adds it globally, which if you have one for your solution, it should even do it solution-wide. So that one I can tell for sure. Now let me try the other one, which is the global suppression. So is there anything else you want to talk about, or is that it?
Well, I mean, how would we feel about things like my private key property?
Which one's
Obs-
So that X509 certificate 2.private key, you essentially never want it. It doesn't work for ECDSA. It on Windows gives you the bad the bad of the two crypto types because that's the property that everyone had hardcast to RSA crypto service provider, and that it frequently pops up on Stack Overflow if someone's like, "Hey, I wrote this code using private key and it doesn't work." And it's like, yeah, because use get RSA private key instead. It works. I don't know where we want our.
Sorry, we can't just make it do the right thing because it's a breaking change or it's not compatible signature-wise, or what's the...
We can't make that one work because if you wrote code in framework, if you wrote code ever using this property, you are 99% likely to have read it and hardcast it to RSA crypto service provider. That's why when we added RSA CNG in Net 4.6, we said we cannot make this ever return RSA CNG. It will break the universe, and we had to make another method. And then the answer is now no one should ever read that property.
I see.
But we didn't have an obsolete story at the time. So really this is just, these are easy. None of these things work. So what we're painting is obsolete. This doesn't ever work. The X509 certificate 2.private key does stuff. It's just probably not the stuff you want. And so I don't know if that meets our current definition of obsolete, or we just continue doing tell people when they use it not to use it, or what. So I'm bringing it up maybe as meta and not necessarily as something that we want to do in the 5-wave, but if I can paint it in 5, I'm happy to.
Yeah, so like I just checked, there's 2 existing diagnostic IDs for obsolete in C#, 612 and 618. 612 is used when no message is encoded, and 618 is used when a message was present. Neither of them will suppress obsolete with a custom diagnostic. So yes, the person would have to suppress the IDs that we introduce. Yeah, we can talk about how we want to do this. Either global, I mean, we can talk to the compiler guys and ask whether they can do a global switch for that, or whether there's another way of doing it.
Because presumably if they had something of like, you know, ignore obsolete, then they would just not even they would just not even process the obsolete attribute, and it wouldn't change their diagnostic flow. It would just change their do I read the obsolete attribute.
Yeah, I believe that's not how their flow works, but
yeah. Somewhere there's a pipeline where they load things into a list, and they would just filter that pipeline. But yeah, I've not seen their code.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe the compiler doesn't do that. I think the way the compiler works is it always raises the diagnostic and then they filter it out later.
Yeah.
Which is the problem, right? Because they might not know anymore that this came from an obsolete attribute. But yeah, so like yeah, I will talk to them and see whether there's anything we can do. But I also think it's reasonable for people to say, yeah, we just have, apply the code fixer. Cool. Anything else? So, did we make a decision on your stuff, Jeremy, while I was playing?
No.
What do you want to happen there?
So yeah, right now the stuff that's on this list, I think every single one of them is a PNSE,
Right.
or the CAS stuff where it just says return true and isn't doing the
Right.
checks that it implies. So the question is, are we also now wanting to allow obsoleting? If you're calling this, you're probably making a mistake. That there's a better API that does what you wanted to do out of this, but fixes scenarios that this one didn't work in.
Yeah, I think so. That to me is kind of more like a feature crew level decision. It's like, do you believe your API is obsolete? I think that's something that the individual area owner needs to decide. I think we should have a bar for what constitutes an obsolete API, but generally speaking, I think the bar we have is like either the API doesn't work or it doesn't work well. And there is a replacement, and sometimes there is no replacement. I think the cases where there is a replacement seems kind of easier to digest when there is none. But even in the cases where there is none, like if the API really doesn't work very well, which is kind of the case for everything on this list because they all throw, I think obsolete is reasonable. What's really hard is if the API sort of works, but we just don't like supporting the feature. That's harder to explain, I think.
Have we considered any concept of like analyzers have multiple gradations? There's error, there's warning, there's also like IDE suggestion.
Right.
Have we considered an equivalent for a solution for a case like this, where basically you get a message about it and obviously in the IDE that says you should really consider since an accurate node.
You're breaking
You
up.
broke up, but are you considering instead of an obsolete, the fixer itself providing a message?
I think it was, can we get an obsolete as IDE suggestion instead of an obsolete as warning?
Yeah. So my concern with IDE suggestion is, I mean, I don't know how much you use VS, but like they're very much the long tail. I mean, like as in, oh, you put a space here. According to your code style, you shouldn't put a space here. Like it's this super tedious, noisy stuff that I pretty much always turn off.
But it is sort of the level of, if you're writing new code, it's in your face, and if it's code that you're not looking at, you don't see it.
No, that's what I'm saying. Like even when I write new code, there's so much stuff going on in that list that even for new code, I generally turn it off. Like I wrote a completely new project over the weekend, and that was the first things I turned off because it was too noisy for my taste.
You turned off the entire concept of painting IDE suggestions?
No, I clicked on the messages tab, which is where all the IDE suggestions show up. And I basically only showed warnings and errors.
But you still got the blue squiggle underneath the wherever it wanted to talk about things.
Well, maybe for notions of what constitutes an IDE suggestion, then what I'm talking about is all the IDE level stuff, like remove unused parameter, unnecessary assignment, all of that stuff, shows up as the informational category, which is basically there's errors, there's warnings, and there's informational. And the informational thing in the error list you can completely turn off. And I believe you don't see squiggles then in the IDE either. And that's what I did.
Okay. I didn't know if the two things were associated or not.
But that doesn't mean that that's the only features we have. I mean, like I think there's certainly an argument to be made for maybe we should think of ways to promote these things without spamming your error list. And I mean, I very much like the idea of things that only show up in the editor because they are kind of way you develop code, and that's when you actually care, right? Like, now is the time to not take a dependency on obsolete stuff, right? Because I will also say, like, to me, like, ReSharper had this feature for years where they would just render obsoleted APIs in the code completion with strikeout font, which is kind of very strong deterrent to use the API, which I honestly think is better than hiding the API. Because at least we acknowledge it's there, but we also tell people, like, you really, really shouldn't be using this anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, really, it's just where do we think the bar is for what we're willing to paint as obsolete? Because certainly, I could propose it as an analyzer of, in our bucket set somewhere, of if you're calling this property, you really want to call one of these other methods instead. But if we think that, because I've answered Stack Overflow questions with, oh, it's soft deprecated. And somebody asked once, what does that mean? It's like, it means every time anybody uses it on Stack Overflow, I tell them not to.
Yeah, that's kind of the reason why I think warnings are more usable, because you copy and paste snippet from Stack Overflow, and since you never wrote it in IntelliSense, you would have never known that it uses obsolete APIs, right? I think to me, it's just like, it needs to be strong enough as a warning, right? Like, as in, like, it either doesn't work, it has a lot of like known problems, or there is an actual better feature available for it. And then I think in that case, the person would just search for that feature, find whatever code snippet that feature offers, and you use that one instead. That will be the fix, right? But for an existing code base, yeah, you would most likely suppress it.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems fine to me.
And to speak for that property specifically, it's if you're writing code in .NET Core, which would be the only place that this would appear, or the obsolete attribute would appear, you don't want the property. The only time you would want the property is if you need to work with Net 4.5.
Right. I mean, there's another option we have, right? I mean, like, we don't even need to turn them all on by default, right? We could ship them all as, suggestion on in the box.
Well, that would require an analyzer. The obsolete is just warning or error. There's no other gradation.
No, the way that would work is there's this global editor config now, this ambient editor config, and you would just add an entry there and set it to none.
And the compiler respects that?
Yeah, I mean that's exactly what a suppressant does actually. If you actually suppress it, it says, configure severity none. It actually creates an editor config file, and in the editor config file it just says .NET diagnostics whatever diagnostic ID you said .severity equals none.
So does that allow someone to take a obsolete as error and ignore it, or ignore the error?
No,
the error is always error.
Okay.
Error is always error. But you can promote it to an error,
right?
Which is what I just did. So basically, I guess if the severity is a warning, you can turn it off. You can promote it to error, but if it's error, it's always an error. So if somebody really doesn't like cast, they can check the editor config file and make all the castings errors.
Fair enough.
So my gut feel is the compiler team will not like this. I think the compiler team will probably tell you that because of these scenarios, they don't want the global opt-out. They would leave it to the project owner to make that determination. But that doesn't mean that we can't do something in that space.
All right, so I'll probably put up a proposal so we can discuss my specific API later. Just trying to get a feel for the temperature of the water right now.
Lukewarm. What's the other one you want to talk about? It was binary formatter, right?
Yes, that'll be easy and not contentious.
Well, it can be contentious. That's fine.
Were we finished with this one for now then?
I think that, yeah, I mean, we reviewed the whole doc. The major takeaway from Stephen was give me a way to turn it all off. But I don't think there was any pushback on any particular APIs. Yeah, so the only other one was we should give principal. Should not reuse the principal permission.
Right. Yeah, all the new things in 0002 need to be a new code. And furthermore, if there are things that we think that we would have a fixer for, where, like, if all the attributes, for example, we called 0010, and all of the things, all of the types that are the attribute type without the word attribute on them are 0011, then we could make a fixer for 0010 that says just delete this attribute altogether.
I mean, that's a good point. I mean, like, I would be careful with doing things like that, though, because now you're mixing things, but because basically, like, now you're like, yeah, I mean, if one of them has a different fixer than the other, maybe, or if some of them have
Right. It's if some of them have a fixer and some of them don't. Then avoid the
Yes.
situation where you get the light bulb with, I'm sorry, there's no fix for this line. So if the attributes, we think that it's an easy fix of you just straight up remove it, but if you use the type inside code, it's probably more complicated, then that may mean that they want a different diagnostic ID.
Well, but that one you can't differentiate, right?
Sure, we could. The
I mean,
use of that,
could.
specifying the attribute in the attribute list, if you used the attribute type directly in code, yes, we wouldn't know what to do about that, but it's unlikely that you would do so. But if I go back to the...
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm saying. It's like...
Because we have here, like, publisher identity permission and publisher identity permission attribute.
Right.
This type, probably the publisher identity permission, probably we don't have an easy fixer of delete all your references to this, because maybe now you have a unbound parameter, or you were assigning a property and we deleted the right hand side of that. But the attribute, you're unlikely to have talked about the attribute instance in your code. You're more likely to have specified it as an attribute on a member, and then the fixer would be just delete the specification of that attribute instantiation. Yes, the fixer would give you a false light bulb of if you actually used it in your own code, because it would then be like, I don't know how to delete this without making your code not compile.
I mean, that's fair. I guess my only concern with that is like, because, I mean, strictly speaking, like, what is the implication of using the same ID? Because the code fixer is still called for each occurrence, right? And you can still say, I handle this ID, and then you can decide to only handle a subset of occurrences that have that ID, but you're not on the hook to actually provide a fix for everything with that ID.
So this is just from something I remember of one of our analyzers we had, which had a sometimes works fixer, that Manish said the light bulb is triggered by the ID. And the fact that there is no fix available isn't discovered until after someone clicks on the light bulb and clicks the fly out, and then it says, oh, I'm sorry, there's no fix for this. So it's, hey, I have a suggestion for you. No, I don't. And that's because otherwise it would have to run the fixer to find out that it produced no fix before rendering the light bulb, which would be a very expensive feature.
I see.
So it's the candidate, like the diagnostic is produced, there's a set of filters that run through, it says, ooh, I handle that ID, and now the light bulb is registered. And then later, when you go to invoke it, it finds out, oh, there's nothing I can do for you. So that's why, and we should confirm that with Manish, but I think that means things we think we can have a fixer for need a different code for things that we believe we can never have a fixer for. Or if we think that it's very unlikely that anyone would be talking about these things in code, then we can deal with the empty light bulb problem. So that's UX, so it's total UEMO.
Okay, so that gives me enough to chew on, I think. So, yeah, naming convention we nailed. Yeah, let me put together some, like, a small list of things for do's and don'ts in this space. Find bar for obsolete. And I will update this document in the beginning to actually call these things out. And then separately we can talk to the compiler guys about a global switcher.
Yeah, so that's, I think, the only thing I have about the bucketing is that we may need fixer relevancy as a decision in the bucket.
Right. So. All right, so Levi, you said something about no quorum. Should we look at the other stuff then, or should we postpone this? Because you have 20 minutes left.
My comment was basically that the same people who are present now are also the people who basically contributed to the draft of this. and it is potentially just going to turn into an echo chamber where everyone says like, "Yep, that's exactly what we drafted."
Yeah, this does look like what we drafted. You're right.
Yeah.
Unless it
So we should
doesn't.
approve it then. So who are the people who have contentious opinions on this then?
Everyone who reports up to Dan who's not us, including us, maybe. WinForms, Eric St. John, others. Basically the people who have already contributed on the original threads regarding this. The ones who had either concerns or have areas of ownership that might require code changes.
I guess I would then ask, what's left for us to discuss if everybody who has an opinion has had the opinion?
I mean, the question is really who owns the decision, right?
John?
Well, based on the conversations that we've been having over the past 2 days, it sounds like the product team collectively. Who that is, maybe John, maybe us.
No, I mean that's always the case, right? But like I think the question is like in even within our own org, right? There's a subset of people who actually own decisions, right? I mean, ultimately, the directors can always say no, but like the question is like as a first take, like who's the owner for that decision, right? And I think it's on them to make sure that they have quorum, and if they don't have quorum, clearly document what the dissent is, and then still say, yep, we heard it, and we still disagree with it. And then if somebody feels like they need to escalate it, then so be it. But I think, so like, does this doc actually call out what the concerns are?
This doc does not call out concerns. This doc is specifically an action plan for .NET 5, .NET 6, and so on.
Yeah, this is basically our opinion what needs to happen, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So like,
I've spoken offline with folks like Steve, Priya, others, and there is amongst that group no concern about at least the 5.0 proposals here.
I see. So that means the compat team is generally happy with it. The people who own binary formatter, us, are generally happy with it. So then I guess the dissent is really coming from people who use binary formatter, right, like WinForms and others, right, which is kind of what you would expect to happen in these cases.
Yes, and to be perfectly honest, like they are satisfied with this in the sense that they know that this has to happen eventually. They're not pushing back from that regard. It's just no one's looking forward to the work, right? It's
of course.
Same as always. And I don't begrudge them that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean...
Yeah, so I mean, I think that, for a now relevant decision, it's if we think that there's ever a time that we're going to get to at least what's currently listed as .NET 7 state, then if no one has issues of the things that we want to do in 5, then that's probably the plan that we should go along with. And then the question is what sort of public or what sort of ref.cs changes are required for that. So it's binary formatters obsolete as warning. Sorry, the serialize and deserialize methods are obsolete as warning. So now we go back to presumably that's a distinct bucket, and then to my earlier point of are we going to add things to the same bucket, maybe when we move it up to the whole type, that's the same ID because it's still binary formatter is broken. Please don't use it.
I mean, I can ask a different question. Like, would we be okay with .NET 5, like the plan that we have right now on screen? We only do the .NET 5 portion and the rest never happens?
I mean, I don't see why we would have drafted this if we didn't plan on doing this in the long term.
No, I guess what I'm asking is like, because to me, like that kind of gives us most of what we want, right? Server-side code generally doesn't use it. It's already documented as being a problem, and then if WinForms continues to use it, and so basically the .NET 6 work never happens, and then the .NET 7 also doesn't happen, then maybe that's okay, right? Because we already would say.
Yeah. Oh, I can actually talk about this now. It's Patch Tuesday. Hooray!
Yeah. I think really the other way of asking that question is let's say we have general consensus that this is the plan, but something derails it before .NET 6 happens. Are we worse off having done the .NET 5 work than doing nothing?
In my opinion, no. I would be sad if any of these got punted, but I think each stage of it gets us into a better position than the stage before.
I would agree with that. That's also why I'm kind of saying, like, if we would stop at 5, I mean, I wouldn't be like cheering in the streets, but like I would say .NET 5 to me already is a marvelous achievement in that sense that, you know, servers don't have it on by default, and it gives you a warning if you deserialize. I mean, that's, you know, it's not everything we wanted, but like it gets us very close to where we want to be, and it seems like that's also one of the short-term things we can actually do. And then the actually expensive work, which is refactoring parts of WinForms to not use it, sure, that would be desirable, but I guess from my point of view that like, you know, if that takes longer than .NET 6 or .NET 7, then that's also not the end of the world, in my opinion.
Correct, but at that point, we now potentially have relegated ourselves to, well, if this never gets done, are we satisfied? And my answer to that is no. And the reason for that is, given the security vulnerabilities that have been reported over the past few months, including the really big one that we released a patch for today, we have very strong evidence that people have not taken our warnings regarding this type seriously. And we do eventually, in the long term, need to excise this type entirely from the ecosystem.
Yeah,
that's
I know that's the really contentious part, but that's the North Star for me.
So the one concern that I would raise with our 5 plan, not saying the 5 plan that I want to remove anything from it, it's the obsolete that we add, which is, I think, the biggest thing of putting it in front of someone of like, look, you have to either go turn off this warning or pragma suppress your invocation of it. And hopefully now you look at the docs, it says, no, we're serious. If you build anything as net standard 2.0, you're not going to see that warning. So I wonder if there's room for us to rev the ref set for net standard 2.0 to include things like obsolete attributes. I don't want to add APIs, I just want to add metadata. Or if we can sidecar obsoletions.
Wouldn't sidecaring them effectively be an analyzer?
Yeah, so I can speak to that a little bit. So my first argument to your statement is it's true, but I don't think it's worth it. And the reason is, if you look at Nougat.org, binary format is used by less than 1%. So like it is very, and I mean, to me, Nougat really is the proxy for net standard 2.0. Like if you're building an app and you're decomposing your app into components, you're not using net standard 2.0, you're just using net core app for the most part. So like it really, net standard is really about reusable libraries, and that's kind of Nougat.org as my proxy there. So for less than 1%, I don't care, in all honesty. Like if there would be more usage on Nougat.org of binary format, I would care, but given the usage is so low, I don't think it's worth it. But as a general principle, I mean, we have said in the past that we may want to ship a reference set of net standard 2.0 that includes nullability annotations, for example. And so if we were to do a ref of it, then I'm fine with also using that as an opportunity to add obsoleting attributes to that set. But the problem that we have there, practically speaking, is we would have to use the obsolete attribute as it is defined in that standard. We can't add to it, which basically means we can't give it the diagnostic ID, which now means if we were to add, let's say the .NET 5 plan is the obsolete binary format of the type, not the method, then I would not do that in net standard, because if you attribute a type and you don't have an ID, then it gets very quickly very noisy. So in that sense, the only thing I would do in net standard, if anything, is at most annotate methods, because they don't, basically explode in terms of how many warnings you get. But I also wouldn't ref the net standard set purely for obsolete. I think that is not worth the cost, in my opinion. Like if we already do it, sure, we can pile on, but like I would not do a ref set update purely for obsoletions.
Makes sense.
I mean, the question now becomes also like for this plan, Levi, like this is the plan that we have set. Is there we probably should review this with management, right, to make sure that they're on board with that.
Yes, so management is okay with the .NET 5 plan. They haven't given feedback on anything beyond that, but I think, honestly, it's just no one's looked that far.
So, and by that you mean tactics, I suppose, right?
I wasn't referring to tactics specifically. I was referring to like our actual release management, like Steve, for instance.
Cool. Okay, so did you ever send it out to the proposal alias?
I did, yes.
Did you? I don't see it.
I believe I did. We can figure that out offline. Maybe I sent it to the wrong alias. That wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, like I mean, basically what I would do is I would just say I would state this as the plan and then see what fallout we're getting from this.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
people will definitely not be happy, but like that's fine.
The 5 plan is entirely. I guess it's not entirely us. We're asking SDK to do something as well.
So the 5 plan is already in progress.
Right.
We already have PRs out to disable binary formatter in WASM all up, to disable it in ASP.NET by default with an opt-in switch. I'm about to push up a PR that obsoletes the deserialize method. So all of these are already in progress because there has already been approval from the stakeholders that this is appropriate.
What is the SDK work that Jeremy mentioned?
The ASP.NET project type has binary formatter disabled by default.
Yeah, there's already a PR out for that, and that's already.
That's going to be in a project template somewhere, not a code change in runtime.
Right.
Is that in the project template or is that in the SDK?
It's in the SDK.
Okay.
It's in Magic. That's not in. Yeah. It's not a library thing. It's a something else thing.
It's in the SDK repo.
I was just picturing a project file now that says binary formatter disabled equals true or something. That would make me sad.
Yes. We already have the guidance document in progress. Rick and Genevieve are reviewing that right now. I already have the ACA MS binary formatter forward link registered. Like all of this is already in progress. The only thing that's going to slip past probably this week is the tracing event source, because I'm still ramping up on how to do that.
And when it's disabled, what's the behavior when I call deserialize?
You get an exception that very clearly says binary formatter is disabled within this application. See this link for more information. And this link goes to a document describing why we did it, how to turn it back on, and what you should be doing instead.
And it's like not supported exception or something like that?
PNSE.
Not supported exception, correct.
Yeah, so just a plain not supported exception, not platform.
Right. Right. On WASM, we had considered doing PNSE because it will never be supported on that platform, but it ended up complicating the code, so people just said, screw it, regular NSE.
Fair enough.
Actually, I would prefer to use PNSE on WASM, to be honest, but it has different reasons, because then our tracing for these kind of things is easier to reason about. Because not supported is usually a state, right? Versus platform not supported is like a permanent situation kind of thing.
Well, platform not supported is change where your code is running and it might work, and not supported exception is.
But like
no.
As I'm saying, like when you look at if we I mean, I'm just saying this from a person who just did the scan of .NET framework, of .NET platform. Then it's harder for us to reason about this when something is not supported versus platform not supported, because platform not supported on Linux is kind of like a given, right? Versus this one would be like, set this setting or set this compat flag and then it might work. Or call this other property before we call this method, right? Which is kind of the, basically change your code, not change where you run. So my other question is like, what is the flag? It's like a compat flag, right?
Yes, there are three ways to set the flag. The first is via a regular app context switch, though there is some back and forth on whether that should be allowed. You could also use runtime config JSON, or you can use a flag directly in the CS proj.
And that just gets forwarded to what?
If you put the flag in the CS proj, then when you do .NET build, it will generate the runtime config for you, including that setting. And then when the runtime host creates the application, that JSON file gets parsed and then passed in to the app context.
Makes sense. Yeah, like I have to be honest, like I don't think the .NET 8 thing will ever happen. I think like in the perfect world we end up with .NET 7. That will be 8 seems optimistic.
Yeah, but you have to
So
write
the-
it down, or we'll never get there.
Yes, the thing that 8 also includes is that all code within the .NET org has all references to binary formatter removed.
Right.
Like resource reader doesn't even have a fallback code path that uses binary formatter, for instance. That's implicit in .NET 8. And the reason for this is, again, with the security patches that went out today, we see that even if people aren't using binary formatter directly, they're using APIs or libraries that indirectly and unbeknownst to them rely on it. And that's
Right.
what's leading to all the problems we're seeing today. There was a case a few years ago where there was a partner team that allowed you to upload regex files to their stuff. It wasn't SharePoint, but it was a SharePoint-like system. And you could upload a regex file, and they're like, oh, a regex file is XML. What's the worst that could happen? Well, regex can contain binary formatter payloads. Like, it allowed people literally to RCE their production service. Because why on earth would they ever have assumed that uploading a regex file was a dangerous thing to do? That's what I mean when I say, like, we need to make sure that our first-party code is not itself a pit of failure that can allow these kinds of things to happen.
Yeah, I mean that's what I'm saying. But to me, like if we turn it off by default and make it throw by default, that to me is already like, 99% of it, right?
I mean, there are other server workloads than ASP.NET, but they'll have to turn it on themselves because we don't have templates for them.
Well, that's why I mean .NET 7 kind of said disable by default across all project types. I assume that's a centralized place in the SDK. Maybe we'll do it then.
Yeah.
That is true, but if this also means that it still runs into the problem where, like, I know that I call into binary formatter from within my own code base, so I do have to turn that back on.
Sure.
But now all of a sudden, like, oh my god, I'm reading regex files. Like, did I still unknowingly introduce a security hole, even though I knew that my own first-party usages were correct?
Yeah,
it's stuff like that terrifies me.
Yeah, so the whole 5 plan we own and is in progress. The first bullet in 6, we own at our layer. I mean, we can't stop. We can tell WinForms not to add new serializable types, but we can't actually prevent them from doing so.
What do we do with exceptions? Because our current guidance says you should mark exceptions serializable, right?
Yeah, the pros is expanded on that, which is if you're an exception that is building as net standard 2.0, then yes, be serializable, and that is the only exception to no new serializable types.
I see. So, but are we already saying this, or is that what you would propose we say?
It's already stated in the document. The prose is very prosy.
The title is succinct.
I mean, the book you just published. The book you just published, I don't think has that in it, right?
The book says exception type should continue to be serializable because it essentially is net standard 2.0. So
basically, this would be a change from the guidance as it exists today.
Yes, we would be saying starting in .NET 6 that we anything that is targeting a net X TFM as its lowest TFM would no longer make serializable exceptions because they're only serializable for throwing across app domains, and we don't have app domains in NetX.
So, Levi, when you say things like beginning with .NET 6, I assume you mean the implementation work for .NET 6, right? This is always assuming at the time when we built the product called .NET 6, not at the time we shipped the product called .NET 6, right?
Right. So what? Yeah. So the thing that's on the screen right now talks about serializable types. What the pros is saying is .NET 5 will be the last release where we introduce types marked as serializable. Okay. In .NET 6 and future versions of .NET will not introduce serializable attributes on existing types or on new types.
Asterisk.
And yeah, asterisk. And this also means that we would go through all of the open issues in the runtime repo where people have asked, can you make this type serializable? Point them to this document and then close all of them as one fix.
Right.
But yeah, so effectively that means starting Thursday, since that's I don't remember what our snap schedule is for when the master branch becomes 6 versus is still 5. But
yeah, The other thing that effectively is stated by this document is if you're reporting an issue in binary formatter and it is not a regression caused by an in-place update, we will not fix it. That's effectively stated by this document. That could prove to be a little contentious, but I haven't really received any feedback on that, surprisingly.
I mean, it's the same as just marking the bug as future and not paying attention to it again.
Yeah.
Just a little more honest. But yeah, so I think we can control all of 5, and we don't have
control most of 6.
internal disagreement with that one. We control the first bullet in 6. Well, I mean, we don't really control the last 2 points. The things like WinForms, WPF, WCF, anything else in the .NET org, we can give them suggestions, but we don't write their code and we don't read their code. So we own making a statement. We don't actually own doing the work. I mean, we can jump in and do the work for them, but really this is where we're suggesting that they promise to do so, and that's the best we can do from the library's perspective. Certainly, if you get, the man in the red polo shirt to say this is the plan, then they are now committed to it. But
yeah.
But so I think that all the parts that we can act on from libraries, I think we're all in agreement with, and that we would, as the things that we need partner teams to cooperate on, as they get completed, then we start ratcheting to further steps in the plan. And if the timeline moves, we'll be sad, but this all seems reasonable to me. I don't know that there's anything else that in this meeting we would talk about, especially because now there's only 4 of us.
Okay, yeah, we're just going to march forward with what's already approved for .NET 5 then, since that's the thing that's of immediate concern.
Yep, and then Emo, there was a question in the chat, if you didn't notice, of would we make an analyzer for the net standard TFMs of warning things that we've made obsolete in future versions, so that you can go back and get that warning for things like the CAS attributes of, hey, you're building net standard, you know that net core doesn't respect these, right? I think that's something we can consider. But it's definitely for you to think of, because it's the question of value versus noise, since net standard means you sometimes care about framework. So, all right.
Seems reasonable.
Oh, there is actually one open question here. One thing that's not resolved. If you have a sec, the original draft of this was ambiguous as to what methods exactly would be marked as obsolete in .NET 5. The current text says only the deserialize method, not serialize and deserialize. Are we okay with that, or would we prefer to do both?
I mean, deserialize is where the danger lives, but if you're doing serialize, presumably you're wanting someone somewhere else to do deserialize, so
yeah.
Telling you, hey, you're writing this thing, and at some point we expect your reader won't read it anymore, seems... It's slightly noisy, but to me it feels like it's worth it.
So it's more correct to do both?
I'm in favor of doing both. Emo?
Yeah.
Okay.
Same.
Yeah. Like, it's not where the problem is. Yeah, it's not where the problem is, but it is where, like, if you're doing writing without reading, then you probably want to know someone somewhere is hopefully eventually not going to read what you're writing.
I mean, I said before, I would just mark the entire type, to be honest. Like, that seems the easiest solution.
Yeah, so the reason I didn't do that for 5.0 is because I thought that would introduce too much noise into the project, whereas if we do just these two methods, it allows you to pragma just a very small handful of
doing it at the type means it's not just the places that you're using it, but if you wrote methods that were passing an object around to configure it, that it flags every single signature as do something, giving you a release of like, here are the 4 places that are actually a problem, deal with that, and you probably deleted the rest of the code before we made there be more warnings, seems like a better signal to noise ratio to me.
Yeah, so for instance, with principal permission attribute, we didn't obsolete the type, we obsoleted the constructor as error. And the reason for that is that allows you to still query to see whether there's a principal permission attribute on a method in your code using the reflection stack. We just don't want you to apply it to anything. But if you want to do type of that, sure, have at it. Eventually, once we obsolete the type itself, then you'll start getting compiler warnings. But that's, the far-flung future.
Yeah, so I think we should just do the serialize and deserialize methods right now for SNR purposes.
Okay. Thank you all for your time.
Sounds good.
All right. And so we're done for the day. Thanks for joining us, everyone online, and see you next time.